Welcome to Section 2, Africa in the Age of Transition, Section 2 of our Exploration chapter, getting to the Age of Transition. Okay. Alright, slave trade. Why do we increase slave trade? We need to get cheap labor source from somewhere. Remember we talked about the Native Americans dying partly because of war and warfare, but mostly due to disease. Smallpox, which was the major contributor, but others like measles and typhoid and all these other kinds of diseases that the Europeans brought over with them, that was included as well. And a major part, in fact 90% of the Native Americans who died during the time period died from disease. The other 10% being your wars and starvation, all those other kinds of things. Alright, so they need a cheap labor source. There was already a cheap labor source set up in Africa. They had started their own slave trade already. It was just exploited by the Europeans. The African slave trade was established by the Africans. They had been warring communities, tribal communities, warring against each other, and in that warring against each other, they would take slaves. They would take captives. It was the spoils of war. You won, you got to take the other group and make them part of your culture by making them slaves within your culture, doing different jobs. Some of them were assimilated into the military. Some of them were assimilated into household jobs. Sometimes they took just the men. Sometimes they took the men and the women. Sometimes they took the men, women, and children all together. But this slave network was already established. The Europeans just come in and exploit it, first on the outer edges and then working more towards the middle of the country. Okay, so it establishes this triangular trade. Okay, triangular trade routes were goods that came from Great Britain and the European area, Spain, Portugal, France even for a while gets in on this. They would leave that area, ship the manufactured goods down to Africa. Guns, copper, silk, rum, many different things. Okay, they would take them to Africa. From Africa, they would get the slaves. So they were giving guns to these local groups who would go out and get slaves and get more slaves and then bring them in. Okay, they would send them from Africa to the Americas, Brazil, the Caribbean islands, the new United States were all getting these slaves. Okay, they were first initiated into work in the sugarcane plantations in the Caribbean. Later on, slaves would work in the cotton fields in the United States, as well as the plantations of the Caribbean islands, as well as the fruit fields of South America and Central America. But these slaves would be brought in. That trade line, that part of the triangular trade from Africa to the Americas, was called the Middle Passage. And this is where you had tight packers, loose packers. Tight packers meant that they put as many slaves in the bottom of the hold as they could possibly get. Loose packers meant that they had them all sitting around, kind of a little more space available to them. Okay, but that line from Africa to the Americas is known as the Middle Passage. Okay, you want to make sure you have that in your notes. All right, and then from the Americas, raw materials: sugar, rice, coffee, tobacco, cotton. We're going back to Europe. So that's your triangle from Great Britain or the European area to Africa, Africa to the Americas, Americas back to Great Britain and Europe. Okay, forms a triangle there, and that was the reason it was called the triangular trade. Okay, we've already talked about the sources of slaves. Again, the sources of slaves were the little independent tribes who were warring against each other, and they would go out and get those other slaves. Now, as the Europeans come in, hand them guns, and give them the leg up, they would get more and more slaves. And as the demand increased in the Americas, the Europeans would get bolder and bolder, and they would move more and more inland as they went along. All right, the effects of the trade. The effects of the trade is obvious on your social, political, cultural, and economic level. The less people you have, the less these things are able to be done. Okay? Especially your culture. Losing that amount of people, losing the talent that's available, removes that culture from Africa. That culture would be transported. It is why the Americas have so much African culture today within their societies. It was brought in, basically imported into the Americas. They would take on those types of things, singing in the fields, songs that they made, stories that were told through the songs or through just word of mouth to the children, stories of homelands, all of that kind of thing would be brought out in their culture, and that culture kind of got transported to the Americas, and kind of enriched the American culture, but depleted the African culture. Okay. The hardest hit were cities like Benin. Benin, the Benin. You see it there on your right. It was a vibrant, beautiful, just amazing city. Intellectually advanced, all kinds of good stuff going on in Benin. And by the time that the slave trade ends, it is the most corrupt city in all of Africa. There were brothers selling their own brothers into slavery. There were parents selling their children into slavery. And even recorded instances of children selling their parents into slavery, believe it or not. Okay? So those types of things really hurt. And removing the mass amounts of the population really hurts the social, political, economic, and cultural aspects of the society. The political side is hurt by that that corruption, and people dealing with the corruption. King Afonso of the Congo writes a letter to the King of Portugal, stating how bad this slave trade is hurting his beautiful city of Ibo, I-B-O, Ibo. And King Afonso writes that letter telling him, look, we have gone along with it for long enough. Don't come back to my city expecting to find slaves. Don't come back to my city expecting to capture slaves or to get slaves, because it was ruining their culture. It was ruining their city. And Ebo provided the most slaves of any city within Africa. So, those things are going to be difficult to recover. Okay. All right, and then the foreign influences. Obviously, the Europeans are a major influence into what happens in Africa. And here you see Africa prior to the undefined areas. Rome dominates to the north. Egypt to the east. Upper and Lower Egypt to the east. You've got the Kush family, Kush tribe, which was actually considered part of Egypt, as well as the Axum, which were the Nubian area, and the Axum and the Kush together forming that Nubian area traded a great deal with Egypt, and often we see where they considered themselves part of Egypt, truthfully. Then you got migrations that happen from the Bantu people moving south, but all of it really undefined. Okay, really not much dominant running of things within the area. And then they develop into these kingdoms, and eventually these kingdoms would be dominant in the area at different times. The kingdoms that you see there stretched across what we today call the Sahara Desert and towards the Gold Coast, right there where Benin is, Benin. Benin, those kingdoms would be ruined by this slave trade. Okay, and most of it was due to the Europeans, and the Europeans infiltrating or imposing their culture into the area. Their forms of ruling, their political sides, their economics, introducing, money to the area, all kinds of different cultural aspects that the Europeans brought with them. Some of them, the Africans readily accepted. Others, the Europeans, forced upon them. But the area was really, culturally influxed by the Europeans. So they kind of assimilated into the European culture. And then you have the Muslim influence as well that causes religious change within the area. Okay, the mosques and the temples that were built to influence the religion, and the religion is really where the Muslims' influence is major. The influence of the Europeans is more along those trading routes and affecting the trading routes, pulling the trading routes to the coastal areas by assimilating them into the culture, by bringing them in, by forcing their ways upon the Africans. The trading moved towards the cities on the coastlines, and by moving towards the cities on the coastlines, it pulled from those cultural centers in the middle of Africa, pulled away from the dominant kingdoms of the time period, and brought things to the Europeans. And it allowed for this influx and assimilation of the cultures. Okay. Alright, so that's it for Section 2 notes. This begins Section 3, and we will handle Section 3 tomorrow night. Thank you for watching, and we will see you tomorrow night.